So our program tonight is with Diana Dretske, curator of the Bess Bower Dunn Museum. And she's going to talk about the Civil War and immigrants in Lake County. I'm going to turn it over to you.
So hi again, I'm Diana Dretske with the Bess Bower Dunn Museum. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about my research about these 5 Union soldiers you see here. In the second year of the American Civil War, the men in this image commemorated their commitment to fight for the preservation of the United States in a photographic portrait that inspired my book, The Bonds of War. What began as a need to put names on faces quickly became a personal project that I undertook on my own time. My research took me to archives and historical societies throughout Illinois and beyond, and to meeting the men's descendants. The result of this research is a collective biography and the first extensive look at the service of the 96th Illinois Infantry since the regiment's history was published in 1887. My research re-envisions the identity of the U.S. common soldier in the Civil War and brings recognition to the contributions of immigrant soldiers. This tintype was donated to the Bess Bower Dunn Museum in 1962 during national celebrations of the Civil War centennial. At that time, the donor was only able to identify one of the men, his grandfather, Scottish-born Edward Murray, who had enlisted in Company C, 96th Illinois. Murray is pictured at the bottom right in the photograph. The events of the Civil War and its aftermath remain relevant to this day, and historians continue to make discoveries in archives that prompt new research and insights into the war. That was the case for me with this tintype of 5 Union soldiers. Imagine my disappointment when I realized that only one of the 5 men was identified. Within the span of just 2 generations, the connection between the donor's grandfather and the other men had been lost. Without their names, their contributions in the Civil War were also lost. Knowing that Edward Murray was born in Scotland and the 96th Illinois had a majority of American-born volunteers, I assumed that some of these men were American-born. I did not anticipate that all of the men were immigrants from Britain and Ireland. With this key discovery, the portrait itself is evidence that immigrants wholeheartedly responded to the call to arms and offers a new perspective on who was enlisting in the Union Army. Statistically, immigrants and the sons of immigrants are estimated to represent 43% of the North's armed forces during the war. Without them, the Union could not have won. And yet stories of immigrant soldiers are largely untold. I was able to identify the men shown here, seated left to right, William Lewin, Laughlin Madden, and Edward Murray, and standing behind them, James Murray and John Taylor. I used census records, historic maps, and the regimental history, and Edward Murray's war memoirs to identify them. Their childhood experiences in Scotland, England, and Ireland, countries where privilege and monarchy ruled, contributed to how they embraced their lives in America and its promise of liberty and freedom, ideals that ultimately led them to enlist in the Union Army. Edward Murray was born in Glasgow, Scotland, so you can see here on this 1840 map. He was the first of these men to come to Lake County. His family immigrated to New York State in 1834 to work in the textile industries. In 1841, his father saw better prospects as a farmer and purchased land along the State Line Road in Lake County. James Murray was from Fife, Scotland, and came to Lake County in 1852 with his parents and siblings. His uncle John had already gone to America and lived across the road from Edward Murray. Uncle John Murray married Ed's sister. John Taylor was born in Newbith, Scotland. In 1854, his elderly father encouraged him and his older siblings to immigrate to the US and reunite with their half-sister who was living in Lake County in the community of Milburn. William Lewin immigrated in 1853 from Oxfordshire, England. With his parents and siblings, they settled on the west side of the Des Plaines River in today's Van Patten Woods Forest Preserve. In 1851, Laughlin Madden immigrated from Ireland with his widowed father and siblings. The potato crop failure and subsequent famine, along with political and religious suppression of Irish Catholics, gave Madden's family little choice but to immigrate. This map shows a partial view of today's Newport Township, and the stars denote where each man or his family settled. The men lived within less than 1 mile of each other on the state line road near today's Russell, Illinois. And what I think is interesting is that none of these men or their families knew one another before coming to America. So they all settled in this community. So you can see at the top of the map is the Illinois-Wisconsin state line. And if you know the area where Russell is, it's right on Russell Road, which is also known as State Line Road. So just to point out a couple of locations, on your far left, the green star is where Madden, the Irish family, came and settled. And that is just west of 94 along the old Skokie Road. So he's on Mill Creek Road there. Edward Murray is just north of Russell Road at the top of the map. And then John Taylor, he was a farm laborer, so he actually lived with a farm family and worked for them. So his siblings were living in Milburn, but he came out here to the Russell area and worked as a farm laborer for the Murray family. So he's listed there. Then below him, the Lewin family, they're on the west side of the Des Plaines River, and this is all Van Patten Woods Forest Preserve. And the James Murray and his family are on the east side of the river, again, still in Van Patten Woods Forest Preserve. So if you're ever out at Van Patten Woods, it's of course all restored to its natural character, but you can think about these men living right there and working in their fields. So by exploring their lives in Lake County, I better understood how their bonds formed. Certainly, they had a united belief in fighting to save their adopted homeland. But years before the outbreak of the Civil War, they made connections with one another. They had shared experiences as immigrants and interacted as neighbors, helping on each other's farms, and also attended community gatherings or met at church. So a couple of these connections I wanted to explain a little bit more, just to give you an example of how they came together in this location. Throughout Edward Murray's youth in New York State, where his family worked in the textile factories in New Berlin and Oswego, the nation's sectional tensions influenced his position on slavery and emancipation. During the 1830s, when the Murrays were living in New York State, Americans were also becoming more aware of the institution of slavery, largely through the efforts of local churches, the anti-slavery press, and traveling abolitionist lecturers. In 1841, when Ed Murray was just 13 years old, his family headed west to Lake County and became farmers. This pattern of giving up work in industries such as textile mills to become farmers was common with settlers to the newly opened West. In Lake County, the Murrays were once again in an area of growing anti-slavery sentiment, brought by settlers just like them from New England and New York. Edward became a prosperous farmer, landowner, and elected official. After first settling in Kenosha in 1851, Laughlin Madden and his family came to Newport Township, where they rented a farm in an area known as Irish Hills, near today's Rosecrans on Mill Creek Road. The neighborhood was called Irish Hills because of the concentration of Irish immigrants who settled there, and also the rolling hills, the topography there. The rolling hills were created when the last glacier melted about 12,000 years ago. It's really a beautiful part of the county. This was an ideal location for the Maddens, who relied on the support of fellow Irishmen and women. Unlike other immigrants who sought liberty and freedom in the United States, the famine Irish left their homes because they feared death and persecution. In the US, many Irish Catholics and German Catholics faced bigotry for their religious beliefs. The large influx of these immigrants brought a backlash of anti-foreign and anti-Catholic sentiment, epitomized by the American Party, also known as the Know Nothings. In the Irish Hills neighborhood, which is just a short distance from Ed Murray and the other men who lived on the State Line Road, the Maddens became acquainted with Ed Murray and his family. Ed's mother and a brother and sister were also Catholic, and they went to church at St. Andrew's on Mill Creek Road. That St. Andrew's Church is the forerunner today's St. Patrick's in Wadsworth. Ed Murray's Irish farmhand also went to that church, and he married Laughlin Madden's sister Anne. So the families were again connected that way. So you can see how these small communities came together and created these relationships. Lake County was one of the strongest areas of anti-slavery sentiment in the state of Illinois. This was due to a large portion of its inhabitants coming from New England and New York State and bringing this anti-slavery sentiment with them. The notice shown here on the left is for a public meeting to discuss the constitutionalism of slavery. This was printed in the Waukegan's Little Fort Porcupine in 1846. Now, this discussion about the constitution of slavery was an issue that Abraham Lincoln also struggled with years before he became president, on how to end slavery within the current political system. So it's interesting that people here in Lake County were debating that issue at this point. One of Lake County's most outspoken abolitionists was William Dodge of Salem, Massachusetts, who settled in Milburn in 1844. He became the pastor of the Milburn Congregational Church. Dodge and his wife represent an important example of New Englanders coming to Lake County and bringing abolitionism with them. In Salem, Massachusetts, William and Sarah Dodge used their home to shelter enslaved people seeking freedom. Sarah was a founding member of the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society. William Dodge was an educator and principal of the city's School for African American Students. When he retired, he became the anti-slavery agent of the Churches of Massachusetts. Agents were paid lecturers who traveled throughout the region to awaken people to the realities of American slavery. Edward Murray's family encountered these agents, such as Dodge, while living in New York. In Lake County, William Dodge continued his crusade against slavery and denounced Illinois' notorious Black laws that restricted the civil liberties of African Americans. Most of these men lived in the United States for less than 10 years when the Confederacy fired on the US garrison at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. This headline from the Kenosha Times exemplifies the patriotism that was felt at the start of the war. The wording was meant to reach all men, citizens, freemen, and citizens with American hearts. The latter was intended for immigrant men who loved their adopted country. The rush of patriotism in the North united Native and foreign-born Americans in this excitement. Dozens of men throughout Lake County enlisted that first year of the war. But the feeling of the State Line Road neighborhood and also of the nation was that the war would end quickly and that only a few men were needed to fill the roles. For this reason, Ed Murray and his neighbors did not enlist in 1861, although they wholeheartedly supported the fight against secessionists. In the second summer of the Civil War, in 1862, The Union's cause became more desperate with the failure of McClellan's Peninsula Campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia. President Lincoln's call for 600 troops forced communities to meet larger quotas for enlistees. Many more Illinoisans were needed in the Western Theater where they could strike at the core of the Confederacy. On August 1st, 1862, Edward Murray was in his harvest field when John Pollock came to call. And this is a photograph of Ed Murray's home on State Line Road. And actually his home is still there today. Pollock was a well-known farmer and horse breeder from Milburn and the key recruiter for a company of men that would become Company C of the 96th Illinois. After Murray signed Pollock's list, Pollock walked across the road, this is State Line Road, walked across the road and enlisted John Taylor and his brother who were working in the fields for a neighbor. Billy Lewin, Laughlin Madden, and James Murray were recruited 2 weeks later by Pollock. While it appears that most of these men had strong feelings about the immorality of slavery, that was not their motivation for enlisting. One thread that resonated with them and other immigrant soldiers was the hope that military service would prove their Americanness. For a 20-year-old James Murray, his reason was patriotism and love of country forced me to abandon the plow. However, as the war progressed, the abolishment of slavery became a priority for President Lincoln and a key source of inspiration in the fight to save the country. Amid this emotional surge of patriotism, Edward Murray's 68-year-old mother, Nancy, made an American flag that was unfurled at their homestead to show their Union support. This is Nancy Murray's great-great-great-granddaughter, Millie Ramsey, with the flag on the day she donated it to the Dunn Museum. Historian Wayne Dworkis noted that during this early period of the war, with their sense of nationalism attacked, communities across northern Illinois became hotbeds of patriotism and union. The national standard and other patriotic banners appeared suddenly at every house and business. So she definitely was getting caught up in all the excitement that was going on. You may notice on the flag that Nancy Murray made the distinctive choice to stitch 13 stars on the field of blue, rather than the 34 stars for the number of states at that time. This symbolically evoked the unity and spirit of the original colonies and the American Revolution. Both immigrants and native-born men cast themselves as the heirs of the revolutionary generation and as the protectors of liberty and freedom. For these foreign-born men, it was much more than America's war. It was a war to uphold their dreams of America that stood for opportunity, freedom, equality, and self-rule. With the coming of war, they feared the nation, not yet a century old, was imperiled and their hopes for the future in doubt. A month after signing the rolls, the men were called to muster in. This is the announcement that appeared in the Waukegan Gazette on August 30th, 1862, for John Pollock's company. And you can see the wording here. It's required to report themselves to him in person for the transaction of such business as may come before them. So they were going to begin their training and also eventually to muster in. The 5 men in the portrait that I researched met at Murray's home and went together to Waukegan to begin their drilling, what would become the 96th Illinois. With multiple regiments forming in the region, these men could have enlisted in a number of different regiments, but they chose the 96th. And this was where a lot of their neighbors were enlisting at this time. This non-ethnic unit had pockets of strong enlistment of men from Ireland, Scotland, and England, and also Germany. And the Germans were mostly from Joe Daviess County, and this is why. The 96th Illinois was a joint venture of Lake County and Joe Daviess County. And if you know where Galena, Illinois is, that's Joe Davies County. Since neither of the counties were able to recruit enough men, they were able to come together to fill out the regiment's numbers. A regiment is made up of 1,000 men, and there are 10 companies of 100 each, give or take a little bit. Lake County supplied 4 companies and Joe Davies County 6 companies. So a lot of the Germans were actually from Joe Davies County. After several days of training or drilling in Waukegan, the 96th Illinois, the Lake County companies were training in Waukegan, left from there at the depot for Camp Fuller in Rockford. When they arrived at Camp Fuller, it was the first time they met their Joe Davies County comrades. So that was quite an auspicious meeting. Also training at Camp Fuller were the 74th, 92nd, and 95th Illinois. The group portrait was taken at Camp Fuller in late September 1862, before the regiment departed for the Western theater of the war. In the year that followed, the 96 would spend much of its time drilling, building fortifications, chopping wood, and guarding supply wagon trains. And Ed Murray even had time to teach John Taylor how to play the fiddle. The 96 served in the war's Western theater in the Tullahoma, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and Franklin, Nashville campaigns, mustering out June 10th, 1865. And you'll see the 96 emblem at the top right. That was actually was able to take a photograph of it. It is not in our collection. A descendant of Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Clark has it in his possession, and that was the emblem from his Hardy hat. The Highland Park Historical Society has identified 43 local men who enlisted in the Union Army. The list shown here is from Highland Park's 150th project. Some of you may have noticed the pieces of the past around the town. These men on this list enlisted in many different regiments. I kind of looked up a number of them just to see if there was any regiment in particular. They were all over the place. So pretty much with so many regiments forming in the Chicago area and throughout the state, men had the option to go where they wanted to enlist. It may have been there were better bounties, or they were working in that area and they decided to enlist from there, or perhaps even to enlist in a regiment with a specific ethnic makeup, such as the 23rd Illinois Infantry out of Chicago, which had 43% of its volunteers were Irish or Irish American. Another Highland Park young man was Thomas Maroney, who enlisted in the 89th Illinois, which was known as the Railroad Regiment, due to the important role the Chicago-based railroad companies had in raising and filling regiments' rosters. Maroney worked for the railroad. The family had left Ireland about 1847, and they settled initially in Connecticut. After several years in Connecticut, they left due to anti-Irish Catholic sentiments there, so they wanted to escape that. By 1860, Thomas and his parents were living in Highland Park. Thomas and his father, William, worked for the railroad, along with their Irish neighbor, James Baggett. Maroney enlisted on August 9th, 1862, in Company C of the 89th. The Railroad Regiment and the 96th Illinois were engaged in many of the same battles in the Western Theater. At the Battle of Stones River, Thomas Maroney was captured by Confederates, but paroled 1 month later. So at this time in the war, they were still paroling prisoners. So he was fortunate in that regard. On June 22nd, 1864, so almost 2 years later, Maroney was wounded at Kennesaw Mountain near Kolb's farm. His wound required his left arm to be amputated. Amputations resulted in more complications than successes, as difficulties such as infections were largely not understood at that time. He died at the U.S. General Hospital No. 2 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and is buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. And I'd like to thank the Highland Park Historical Society and Nancy Webster for providing research on the Maroney family. Maroney, excuse me. So it was actually a year into their service before the 96 Illinois first battle, which took place at Chickamauga, Georgia in September 1863. It would be their single most important engagement of the war. Chickamauga was a Confederate victory and by far the deadliest battle fought in the West. It was second only to Gettysburg in the number of lives lost during the entire war, and Gettysburg was just a few months before that. The 96th Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Clark was killed at this battle, so that emblem that you saw earlier belonged to him. The regiment's historian Charles Partridge wrote, though long years have passed since the name Chickamauga was hurled into history, the hand trembles and the pen falters as the word is written. The men of the 96 at this point were very well trained. They had spent their first year of service basically training, digging trenches and guarding prisoners and supply trains. So they were very well trained, but they were green and spoiling for a fight. It was the hope of many of the foreign-born men that wartime service would gain them social status and acceptance. And fighting rather than digging fortifications was considered the best way to show your worth. They were young men and they wanted to do their part. As part of the Army of the Cumberland, they were anxious to be of use to Major General William Rosecrans against Confederate General Braxton Bragg. The 96 was part of Granger's Reserve Corps and was among the troops sent to support Major General George Thomas, who would later be known as the Rock of Chickamauga. On September 20th, the men were marched on the double quick for nearly 2 hours. When they arrived at Snodgrass House to support General Thomas, they barely had time to wipe the sweat off their brows before they were ordered to fight on Horseshoe Ridge. General Granger said to Thomas, "They are raw troops and they don't know any better than to charge up there." Edward Murray recalled that at Chickamauga in the charge at Horseshoe Ridge, some of the men were hit, but we did not stop until we got to the top of the rise when we were ordered to fire at will. And a rebel battery and infantry were right in front of us, and they poured galling fire into our ranks. Murray was struck between the shoulders near the right side of the spine. This completely paralyzed his lower limbs and rendered him perfectly helpless on the battlefield. William Lewin tried to carry a paralyzed Murray off the field, but Murray was like a dead weight and the rebel line was approaching. So Murray told Lewin, "Billy, run, I am all right." Moments after Billy Lewin ran from Murray's side on the battlefield, Lewin was grazed by a bullet, slightly cutting his head and plowing a deep furrow about 10 inches in length along his back. This disabled him from the remainder of the battle. Murray was left paralyzed on the battlefield in the hands of the enemy for 10 days before being exchanged into Union lines and taken to a hospital. So with the Union Army losing this battle, they basically had to abandon their wounded men in the field, and they couldn't stay to bury anyone or do any of that at that time. So Murray was in the hands of the enemy for 10 days. Murray later recalled that as he lay on the ground at Chickamauga, he had time to think of his home in Lake County and his loved ones, and whether he would ever see them again. His brother came from Lake County to take him home to convalesce, and Murray eventually regained partial use of his legs. John Taylor was shot in the wrist in the first charge on Horseshoe Ridge. He walked back to a field hospital on his own and eventually made it to a hospital in Nashville where his arm was amputated. and 6.5 weeks later, he died. John's siblings were unable to overcome the emotional and financial strain of bringing his body home to Lake County for burial. In 1866, after the creation of the Nashville National Cemetery, Taylor's remains were reburied there. Laughlin Madden survived the Battle of Chickamauga without injury, but was captured while on picket duty days later on Missionary Ridge. He died of scurvy at Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prison in Georgia, and is buried there. James Murray was not at Chickamauga with his comrades because he was sick with one of the intestinal illnesses that a lot of the men suffered from. So he had been hospitalized actually a week or so before the battle. He was the only one of these 5 men to be with the regiment from start, so from their muster in Rockford to finish when they mustered out in Tennessee in June 1865. After the war, Ed Murray, Billy Lewin, and James Murray were active in veterans organizations. They are buried at Mount Rest Cemetery in Newport Township. That is a really beautiful cemetery. It was recently restored with funds raised by the Newport Township Historical Society and also the Daughters of the American Revolution, the chapter in Angel B. Cook chapter in Libertyville. In the post-war, reunions became a very important thing for the veterans. After the war, veterans struggled with emotional and physical disability, and many Union veterans continued to also advocate for the rights of freedmen, and they donated to the cause of freedmen. So they were very concerned that what they had fought for to free the slaves would revert back, especially with President Johnson pardoning rebel leaders and such. And so they were very concerned about all their efforts being for naught. So they continued to advocate for those things. In 1875, the 96th Illinois held its first reunion with their Joe Daviess County comrades. And you'll see the ribbon on the left was actually from another one of their reunions with their Joe Daviess County comrades, and that one was in 1886. So they would continue to get together and take turns, whether they would be in Joe Daviess County or Lake County. In 1878, Lake County veterans formed the Soldiers and Sailors Association. And the county's first GAR, Grand Army of the Republic chapter, was founded in Wakanda in 1883. So there were a lot of these 2 very major veterans associations that they belonged to, and then they would attend the annual campfires. The one on the right, the photograph, was one of the Soldiers and Sailors reunions, and this was held in Grays Lake in 1900. And so you can see a lot of the guys are still there. They're not all, I should add, these are not all 96 Illinois veterans. They're any veterans, Civil War veterans living in Lake County who belong to the association. So they're from a lot of different regiments. Now, Henry S. Bale of Highland Park, he served as president of the Soldiers and Sailor Association in the early 1890s. He was a veteran actually of the 38th Wisconsin Infantry, and he settled in Highland Park after the war. During his tenure as president of the association, he promoted the raising of flags over schoolhouses. Now today, there are flags over schoolhouses, you just take it for granted. But at this time, that wasn't the case. So it took Civil War veterans to promote and advocate for doing that. And what Henry Vale said was this was to instill into the minds of school children historical facts of the war and love of country. So this was something that they really upheld and worked and had committees and talked to public officials and school teachers and everyone to get involved in doing this. Annual meetings themselves were also a powerful tool in affirming the events of the war, and it provided the veterans with an official platform to share their experiences. So they would get up, talk about a battle or talk about their own experience, or just be together with comrades they hadn't seen in years. And what's interesting about this is these were open to the public. So you would often get well over 1,000 people coming to hear their stories and to see this group of men and to honor their service. So it was really quite the occasion when they had these annual campfires. Another major accomplishment for the veterans was to memorialize their dead comrades by commemorating a monument in the courthouse square in Waukegan. The Monument Association was formed in 1865, but their dream would take 34 years to be realized. And this really just came down to the fact that they couldn't raise enough money. So after the Civil War, there was definitely very hard economic times. So people didn't have a lot of money to spare. And it just took them years and years and years to get money and to be able to get the county itself to appropriate funds to help with this project as well. So 34 years, and they kept working on this idea of we need to commemorate our dead comrades. And what I find interesting about this monument is that so many Civil War monuments they list the men who served. And this one, these men were very specific. We don't want our names on that monument. We want to honor the ones who died during the war. So this is very unusual in that regard, I feel. So shown here on the right are members of the Grand Army of the Republic standing at the base of the monument on dedication day in August 1899. So finally, in 1899, they were able to celebrate the unveiling of this monument. And this image on the left, I took just this January. So interestingly, the monument has been moved since they dedicated it, but it's still at the courthouse in Waukegan. And here is a close-up of some of the veterans in front of the Civil War monument that day. And you'll see on the right is a 70-year-old Edward Murray. And on the left, African-American veteran Henry Mcintosh, who served with Michigan's 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. Mcintosh was born enslaved on a plantation in Kentucky, and after the war's commencement, made his way to freedom on his own to Detroit, Michigan, and that's where he enlisted. After the war, he came to Lake Forest and settled there and raised a family in Lake Forest. And so he was a member of the local Grand Army of the Republic group and was here for dedication day as well. Not too far from Edward Murray. I just think that's amazing. So solving the mystery of these unidentified men in the photo was just the beginning of my journey that ultimately revealed this unique story of immigrants who settled in Lake County as farmers and why they chose to save the United States at so critical a time in the nation's history. Like many immigrant soldiers, these men sought gratitude for their service, and the greatest prize of all was to be accepted as an American. From a letter written to his sister in May 1863, John Taylor expresses it best. As the boys say, if we don't get our chunk wiped out by the rebels, we will probably live to be respected and acknowledged as good American citizens. Hope so. Through these men, we can better understand the motivations of ordinary citizens who were immigrants and who embraced America's ideals of freedom and liberty and represented Illinois and Lake County in the fight to preserve the Union. Thank you. Who, Edward Murray? Oh, I got his war service records and I didn't see that in there. No, he lived a full life here in Lake County. Newport. Yeah. Yeah, Russell, the name Russell didn't come about until the 1870s. And then he did eventually retire off his farm. We're talking about Edward Murray here at the bottom right that started this whole quest. And yes, and one of the reasons why I was able to identify when the photo was taken was because of his rank. Because once they left Camp Fuller, within a very short time, he was promoted to sergeant. So I knew, and he had also taken a leave of absence. So I was able to pretty much get about a 10-day or so time frame when the portrait was taken. Yeah, and it's interesting because it is kind of a crowded photograph with 5 guys in it. But it does tell us that their connection to one another was really important, and they wanted to preserve that and share it with their families. In fact, in Edward Murray's war memoirs, he talks about being at Chickamauga and laying on the ground and needing help. And he actually says, partner, can you help me, partner? Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah, so early in the war, there was a parole system set up so that they would, and this is something that the Army had done for, for decades, that you would get prisoners and you would do an exchange. But that pretty quickly broke down during the Civil War, and they tried to rectify that with the Dix Hill cartel, and it ended up ultimately with what you know as Andersonville and also Camp Douglas in Chicago, where it was just overflowing with prisoners because no one wanted to exchange anymore for many reasons. Part of it had to do with the Confederates did not want to exchange Black Union soldiers, and the Federals did. So there were just a lot of, it's a very complicated topic, but I hope that kind of very generally says that when Thomas Maroney of Highland Park was captured early in the war, he was fortunate to be paroled because later on they weren't. They were just moved from prison to prison to prison. For example, Laughlin Madden, the last prison he was in was Andersonville, and that's where he died. But prior to that, he was at Richmond and Danville. So they just kept moving them when they would have not enough food or not enough space, or a lot of reasons for doing that. There was not a draft in Lake County, and a lot of the men felt it was more honorable to enlist because they didn't want to be drafted. That was felt to be dishonorable. And they had bounties that encouraged the men to enlist so that you could know that, for example, Edward Murray, he had a family, he had a really nice farm going at that point. He was 34 years old when he enlisted, and he still knew it was the right thing to do. There's many reasons for enlistment. Sometimes it was just the adventure. Some people wanted the pay, so yeah. Yeah, and Illinois provided one of the largest group of soldiers from the North during the war. So, right, there just wasn't a reason to have a draft. So a draft wasn't automatic. I know we hear about these drafts a lot, and you hear about the riot in New York and all those things that occurred because of the drafts, but that wasn't the case here in Illinois. That is, yeah, thank you. So the quote about Edward Murray, direct quotes from him when he was lying on the battlefield Chickamauga, are from his war memoirs. So later in life, he did write about his immigration to the United States and his family and coming to Lake County. And then he also talked about the war and John Pollock coming, and all of those stories are coming right out of Ed Murray's mouth. Thank you for writing those down for us. And so that it's really quite emotional. And in my book, I quoted a number of things he said, but to read it all, it's just obviously at the time, and even years, decades after the war, it was still very emotional for him to revisit those memories. When he was lying on the battlefield at Chickamauga, at one point, the Confederates did help the wounded prisoners out there. And at one point he was moved to where there was a small house. Oftentimes the battles occurred where people lived, it just kind of, they sprung up in different places. And there was an older woman who lived in this little house, and here's a bunch of Union soldiers that are wounded and laying on the ground around her house. And she came out with some chicken broth. She said that she was forced to sell the chickens, but she asked if she could cook them and keep the broth. So that was the Confederates did that. So she had chicken broth, and she would come out and give Edward Murray a little bit of chicken broth. That's what kept him alive, because he was laying there for 10 days without water and without food. And he was bleeding, and he said he was in no pain because he was paralyzed. But really it was this woman who saved his life, but he doesn't mention her name. And I have really tried to figure out who she was. I even contacted David Powell, who really is the expert historian on the Battle of Chickamauga, to see if he could kind of do like a trajectory of where he was on the battlefield and such. And we just can't quite figure out exactly, because it's a shame that we don't know who she was when she was doing that for the wounded. Yeah. Well, that's a lovely sentiment. Thank you. I agree. We need to remember these stories. And what's surprising to me, and as I've talked to other people and have gone around the state giving this presentation, is this is a different story that's being told. And there's a lot more stories that could be told, right? And maybe it's your family. Maybe it's someone from this community where another story could be told. And it's really important to tell not just the stories of the big battles and not just the stories of the officers and such. And that's kind of been the tradition all along. And that's helped us to understand the war for sure. But there were an awful lot of people, a lot of men and sometimes women in disguise fighting, that we should know more about their stories. So I'm just thrilled to finally be able to share this story, which I spent many years researching, and my husband went on a lot of trips with me. We were down in Chickamauga. I think it was on the hottest day of the year when we walked across the field there. Of course, that would be the hottest day. So, but thank you, and thanks for your interest in hearing the story and letting me share it with you tonight.
I actually have a question. Can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
So how many of the gentlemen eventually became American citizens?
Well, interestingly, I think only one was naturalized, because only the 3 survived, and I only found naturalization record for James Neary. And the timing of him getting naturalized was just a year or 2 before he ran for county office. So I think he was thinking in terms of, you know what, I fought to be considered an American and I want to take this next step. And I've kind of surprised I haven't found a record for the other 2 being naturalized. Maybe it's out there and it just didn't get properly documented. So one for sure did.
So being in the war didn't automatically make you a citizen, or maybe they just didn't bother signing up?
No, not even today. And that's why this story is still relevant today. Immigrants that come to the United States and join the US military do not automatically become citizens for it. They can be sent back to their country of origin. So I think this is an interesting thing to think about, and realize that there should be some prize at the end. That's certainly what John Taylor and the others were hoping for, to be considered and respected as American citizens. Certainly, yes. And Kathy pointed out some people who get deported, there's something else going on there, certainly. But it is interesting because I think it surprises people to learn that just by enlisting in one of the armed services, you don't automatically become an American citizen. Thank you. I appreciate being here. I love Highland Park Historical Society. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.